By 1987, the black unemployment rate was double that of whites. Liberals and leftists wanted social spending, but there was a declining taxpayer appetite for social spending, meaning that implementing too many programs and raising taxes, especially if those programs would help minorities, was treated with hostility. As Bradford Martin wrote in the other 80s, these black mayors needed to figure out how to leverage jobs and services to improve the lives of the poor and minority citizens from the pro-growth business community that represented the best hope for economic revitalization in an age of declining public investment. Shrinking tax revenue from white flight meant these mayors turned to whoever was willing to give money, like real estate developers and investors who wanted to build downtown financial centers. This was the case for Tom Bradley of LA, a former cop who developed the downtown business district at the expense of poor communities whose jobs had dried up when rubber and steel plants shut down. So it was black mayors shouldering the consequences of deindustrialization, as well as the devolution tactics used by Nixon and Reagan, needing the approval of moneyed private citizens to provide what should have been basic public services. Also, while white mayors didn't have to worry about appearing to be fair to all races, black mayors did, and were often criticized and challenged for trying to make up for years of inequity. Take Harold Washington of Chicago, whose 1983 mayoral campaign was about self-determination and community control. He had originally come to prominence as an Illinois state representative, expected to stick to the party script until he supported legislation addressing police brutality in Mayor Richard Daley's Chicago. The city was notoriously run by a Democratic machine built on patronage and party loyalty, so speaking against the mayor of his party lost him internal political clout. Washington wasn't radical, perhaps demonstrated by his silence on the assassination of Fred Hampton in 1968, but his commitment to mainstream black causes like championing the first Martin Luther King Jr. holiday made him an attractive local politician. He made an unsuccessful mayoral run in 1977 before successfully running for the House of Representatives in 1980. Away from the small Chicago machine on Capitol Hill, Washington was vocal in supporting a nuclear freeze and diverting 20% of the defense budget to social and urban programs, along with opposing Reagan's foreign policy in Central America. So, during the 1983 Chicago mayoral race, Washington was elected with only 36% of the vote. However, though 80% of Chicago's citizens were Democrats, Washington won with only 52% of their vote, which broke down to 99% of the black vote and 12% of the white vote. Most of those white voters were lakefront liberals, while white working and middle-class voters had split between the two white candidates, benefiting Washington but revealing the lack of enthusiasm for the city's first black mayor. Said one white Democratic boss ahead of the primary, "It's a racial thing. Don't kid yourself. I'm calling on you to save your city, to save your precinct. We're fighting to keep the city the way it is." Washington spent most of his first term facing intense opposition from racist white Democrats loyal to Daley and the old Chicago machine. Nevertheless, Washington instilled black people in key leadership positions, passed a Tenants' Bill of Rights, limited campaign contributions for companies holding city contracts in an attempt to break up the long-entrenched political machine, and ended politically motivated hirings and firings. All of this he did in his first 3 years, and it was essentially him getting a working majority so he could disassemble the machine that had generational effects on black citizens. To some black Chicagoans, Washington wasn't dedicated enough to black causes. To whites, he gave preferential treatment to black people. Despite this, Washington was re-elected in 1987. He set to work changing the way that community development block grants were dispersed to the community. Before, a machine-appointed bureaucracy dispensed funds at its discretion, but Washington rerouted federal funds directly to the communities and enhanced the power of non-governmental organizations to participate in decision-making. Improvements to housing, along with community-based strategies to improve education, were at the top of Washington's agenda when he unfortunately died of a heart attack 9 months after his re-election. Other notable mayors include civil rights leader Andrew Young in Atlanta, who in 1981 ran for mayor after many people insisted he do so, like Coretta Scott King. He continued Maynard Jackson's programs for including minority and female-owned businesses in city contracts, while also bringing in $70 billion in new private investment and handing out more college scholarships. Like many urban areas, Atlanta was seeing a surge of homelessness, particularly due to a decline in the availability of single-room occupancy housing. After 17 homeless men died in 1981 from exposure to the cold, Young helped create a homeless task force and shelter shelter. But check this. He was the mayor who helped lobby approval to host the Olympics in 1996, which would grow the Atlanta homeless population by destroying public and low-cost housing. The city council and governor also approved of the construction of the Georgia Dome for the Atlanta Falcons after the team's owner threatened to move. The dome was projected to cost $210 million and would be placed in a poor black neighborhood. Young also renovated the closed underground Atlanta into a shopping destination. Many observers were pissed that the money did not go to social programs for the most vulnerable. Despite, or perhaps because of his prioritization of businesses, Andrew Young was re-elected in 1985 with over 80% of the city's vote, demonstrating his long-standing popularity and making him consider a run for governor after his two-term mayoral limit. In Detroit, Mayor Coleman Young had been elected in 1973, narrowly defeating a police commissioner. He hired more black cops in an attempt to integrate the police department, have residents patrolling their own communities, and to combat police brutality. Keep in mind that many black Americans saw hiring more black cops to police their own neighborhoods as an important policy win. And in Detroit, this seemed to work. Complaints against police fell from 2,323 in 1975 to 825 in 1982. Coleman Young also prioritized the revitalization of downtown, affirmative action, and attracting new job opportunities for the city's unemployed, of which black people were 25%. He also raised taxes a lot, reduced the city's workforce, and saw rising gang violence, drug use, and arsons.
More people under age 21 in Detroit have been shot in the first 10 months of 1986 than in all of 1985. More than 70 young people have been killed, a 10% increase from last year.
The drug trade has created new status symbols for Detroit youngsters. The beeper to stay in touch and the handgun to stay in control. Status symbols that are catching innocent bystanders in the crossfire.
You sitting there playing cards and then boom, bullets just started coming from everywhere.
Tanisha Baldwin was killed when 5 men opened fire on the wrong house. She was 8. Willie Brown was walking past the house that night when he was hit.
Young was politically strategic. Said historian Ken Coleman, Young's press secretaries were always white. He chose to keep the police commissioner of the previous mayor, who had formerly been an FBI agent, the very same agency that investigated Coleman Young for 40 years of his life. Young would serve a total of 5 terms, an impeccable feat for a man who traveled in leftist circles in the 40s and 50s and was even interrogated as a suspected communist before the McCarthy-era House Committee. Then there was the infamous Mayor Marion Barry of Washington, D.C., who was elected in 1978. Though his achievements have been overshadowed by mishandling the crack epidemic response and himself being exposed for smoking crack in 1990, he started out doing what he could in cash-strapped D.C. He created a youth summer job program, restored housing units, and kept many jobs for citizens when similar cities couldn't. While he got more minority-owned firms hired for city contracts, his administration gave contracts to his political connections and contributors worth around $856 million, inflating the cost of services in other sectors. And because Barry kept making city jobs to battle unemployment, his deficit swelled. His leadership only got worse with time. For the 1986 mayoral elections, he passed a law to get his only true potential competitor for a third term, Jesse Jackson, from running. When a national winter blizzard hit Washington, D.C. in 1987, Barry was in California, in town to see Super Bowl 21. D.C., bogged down in 14 inches of snow, was shut down for several days while Barry stayed to watch the Giants kick the Broncos' asses and see players dump a cooler of Gatorade over Bill Parcells' head. Oh, and Barry allegedly collapsed from cocaine use. To make matters worse, over the next 2 years, D.C. would earn the highest murder rate in the nation, with 369 and 434 homicides, respectively, in 88 and 89.
Approximately 33-year-old black male. He's been shot 3 times, that's shot 3 times.
It's like living in a war zone. You hear gunfire every night. We're scared.
The saying in Washington these days is that D.C. doesn't stand for District of Columbia, but for Dodge City.
All of us are appalled. We're agonizing about it. We don't like the fact that we had 372 murders last year.
It's as if the White House and the Capitol were positioned on the streets of the Old West. These dots are where the fatal gunfights took place in the last year, most of them related to the sale of drugs.
The severe limitations of black mayors made people realize that black mayors weren't enough. Some were even directly involved with violence against black people, like in the case of Philadelphia's first black mayor, Wilson Goode.